There's a stove in a farmhouse outside Millersburg, Ohio, that burned for 90 minutes this morning. 2 small pieces of wood. The fire has been out for 6 hours. I'm standing in the living room right now, and the wall behind me is warm. Not hot. Warm. The kind of warm that soaks into your hand when you press it flat against the surface. The kind of warm that does not spike and drop the way your furnace does. It is just steady, even constant warmth spreading through every room of this house at the same temperature. No thermostat on the wall, no ductwork in the ceiling, no furnace running in the basement, no bill arriving at the end of the month. The man who built this stove spent $50 on materials and 1 weekend on construction. He heats his entire home through an Ohio winter on less wood than most Americans burn in a single week. And when I asked him why nobody outside of Amish country seemed to know this was possible, he looked at me for a moment and said something I have been thinking about ever since. He said that when something works this well and costs this little, the people who profit from the alternative make sure it stays quiet. That is what this video is about. A heating system that has existed for over 1,000 years, that burns 90% less fuel than any conventional wood stove, that produces emissions so clean it outperforms every certified stove on the market by a factor of 20, and that in 37 states you are legally prohibited from building in your own home. Not because it is dangerous, because it does not generate a monthly bill. Before we get into how this system works, you need to understand exactly how badly the system you are probably using right now is failing you. Because the gap between what you have and what is possible is so large that until you see it clearly, the rest of this will not land with the weight it deserves. A conventional wood stove, the kind with the black cast iron body and the glass door that glows orange when it is running well, burns wood at around 1,000 degrees inside the firebox. That sounds like an intense and thorough combustion process. It is not. At 1,000 degrees, wood does not burn completely. The volatile gases and organic compounds in the smoke, the substances that represent a significant fraction of the total energy stored in the wood, do not ignite at that temperature. They travel up the flue as smoke at 400 to 600 degrees Fahrenheit and exit through the chimney. Every time you see smoke rising from a chimney in winter, you are watching stored energy leave the house. You are watching money float into the cold air. The efficiency rating on the box says 75%. That is a laboratory measurement taken under optimal controlled conditions. In a real home, with real wood of varying moisture content, a door opened and closed to add fuel every few hours, and a flue that loses heat through the wall it passes through, the actual operational efficiency of a conventional wood stove is closer to 35%. That means 65 cents out of every dollar worth of wood you buy goes straight up the chimney, not into your home. Not into warmth you can feel, into the atmosphere above your roof, and that is before you account for creosote. The incomplete combustion that produces that smoke also deposits a tar-like substance on the interior walls of your chimney every single time you burn. That creosote accumulates over seasons, becomes increasingly flammable as it builds up, and is the primary cause of chimney fires in homes with wood stoves. So the conventional wood stove is simultaneously wasting most of your fuel and building a fire hazard inside your wall while it does it. This is what the American heating industry sold an entire country as the normal and acceptable way to heat with wood. The system the Amish use does something so fundamentally different that it is almost easier to think of it as a different category of technology entirely, rather than an improvement on the familiar one. The principle begins with combustion temperature. Where a conventional wood stove burns at 1,000 degrees, this system burns at 1,800. That additional 800 degrees of combustion temperature is not a minor refinement. It is a phase transition in what happens to the fuel. At 1,800 degrees, the volatile gases that would have escaped as smoke in a conventional stove ignite inside the combustion chamber. The smoke itself burns. The organic compounds that represent the energy content of the wood are consumed rather than wasted. What exits the system is not the black and gray smoke column you see rising from a conventional chimney. It is water vapor and carbon dioxide, the complete combustion products of wood burning as thoroughly as wood can burn. The exhaust temperature leaving the system is between 90 and 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Compare that again to the 400 to 600 degrees exiting a conventional wood stove. That difference, 300 to 500 degrees that stays in the house instead of leaving through the roof, is the entire source of the system's extraordinary efficiency. But the combustion chamber is only the first half of what makes this work. The second half is how the heat from that combustion is stored and delivered, and this is the piece that most people find difficult to believe until they stand in a room heated by it. In a conventional metal stove, the heat generated by combustion radiates from the surface of the metal box. Metal heats quickly and cools quickly. It has almost no capacity to store thermal energy. The surface of a running wood stove is hot enough to cause serious burns. The moment you stop feeding it wood, it begins cooling immediately and is back to room temperature within a few hours. The heat delivery is violent and uneven, too hot near the stove, cold near the windows, and gone entirely when the fire dies. The masonry system routes the hot gases from the combustion chamber through a large mass of brick, stone, or cob before they exit to the outside. Cob is a traditional building material made from clay, sand, and straw that has been used in construction for thousands of years. As the gases travel through the internal channels of this thermal mass, they surrender their heat to the surrounding material. The bench or wall that forms the exterior of the heater absorbs that heat gradually over the hour or two of the burn. When the fire goes out, the mass has become a heat reservoir, a thermal battery holding an enormous quantity of energy that it will release slowly and evenly into the living space over the following 12 to 24 hours. The surface temperature of the mass never becomes dangerous. It stays in the range of warm to comfortably hot, similar to a sun-warmed stone wall in autumn. Children sit against it. Animals sleep beside it. The heat it delivers is radiant rather than convective, meaning it warms the surfaces and bodies in the room directly, rather than heating the air that then rises to the ceiling and stratifies. Rooms heated by radiant thermal mass feel uniformly warm at every height, every corner, every distance from the heater. It is a qualitatively different heating experience from anything a forced air furnace or a conventional wood stove produces. The fuel this system consumes is not the split hardwood logs you are used to hauling from a woodpile. It is small diameter dry wood, sticks the thickness of your thumb, fallen branches from the yard, scrap wood from a workshop, garden trimmings dried and saved through the year. You light the fire with newspaper and the small fuel catches immediately. Within 2 to 3 minutes, the combustion chamber reaches the temperature where the roaring updraft effect begins, a sound that builders describe as similar to a small jet engine, caused by the intense convective forces generated by the 1800-degree heat riser at the core of the system. You feed it fuel for 45 to 90 minutes, then you stop. The fire consumes itself and goes out. And for the next 12 to 24 hours, you do not touch the heater again. The fuel reduction numbers that have been documented by builders and researchers who made the transition from conventional heating to this system are extraordinary enough that they sound implausible until you understand the thermodynamics behind them. Ianto Evans, a Welsh-born builder and researcher who spent decades developing and documenting the modern iteration of this system at the Aprovecho Research Center in Oregon, recorded his own fuel consumption before and after the transition. Before, heating his home through an Oregon winter with a conventional wood stove required 4 to 5 cords of wood. After building and operating the mass heater, the same home in the same climate through the same length of winter required approximately 2/3 of a single cord, an 80 to 90% reduction in fuel consumption from the same house and the same occupants. A cord of wood is a stack 4 feet wide, 4 feet tall, and 8 feet long. He went from needing a woodpile the size of a large truck to needing a woodpile that fits in a wheelbarrow. Builders across the country who have made the same transition report similar results. In moderate climates with mature trees on the property, some homeowners report heating their entire house through winter with fallen branches collected from their own land. No chainsaw, no splitting maul, no purchasing or hauling split wood. Just picking up what the trees have already dropped and feeding it into a system that extracts virtually every unit of heat the wood contains, before releasing only water vapor to the outside. The financial translation of this performance difference is stark in a way that becomes difficult to look away from once you calculate it. The average American household currently spends between $1,400 and $2,400 per year on home heating. Over a 30-year mortgage, that compounds to between $42,000 and $72,000 sent to utility companies and fuel suppliers for the single purpose of maintaining a livable interior temperature. The materials required to build the basic version of this system are a salvaged metal barrel, 20 to 30 fire bricks, clay sourced from the property or purchased inexpensively, a metal tube for the heat riser, and refractory mortar for the high temperature sections. Total material cost between $50 and $100. Total construction time for a basic version, 1 weekend for a person with no prior masonry experience following documented instructions. $42,000 over 30 years, or $50 once. Those are the actual numbers, and they do not require any favorable assumptions to produce. The history behind this system is longer and more continuous than almost anyone in modern American housing culture is aware of. And understanding it makes the current situation feel less like an accident and more like a decision someone made on your behalf. The German masonry heater tradition, known as the Kachelofen, has been documented continuously for over 1,000 years. Its development was driven by a crisis that should feel familiar. By the 15th century, the forests of Central Europe were disappearing. Germany and Austria faced wood scarcity as a genuine national emergency, with populations growing and forests shrinking under the pressure of fuel demand from conventional open hearths and rudimentary stoves that wasted the majority of the wood they consumed. The response was the emergence of a specialized craft profession, the Hafnermeister, master stove builders whose entire professional knowledge was organized around the challenge of heating homes through brutal Central European winters using the smallest possible amount of wood. Their solution was the Kachelofen, A ceramic and masonry heater that burned small quantities of wood at extremely high temperatures, captured the resulting heat in a large thermal mass, and released it evenly over an entire day. These craftsmen were compensated and respected at the level of architects. Their stoves were passed down through families and carefully maintained across generations, because a well-built Kachelofen was an asset that could last a century. But the principle was not European in origin. It was universal, arrived at independently by multiple civilizations across thousands of years, because the physics is the same everywhere, and the problem of staying warm through winter is universal. In Korea, the Ondol system channeled heated air from a firebox beneath a raised stone floor, heating the entire sleeping and living surface from below and retaining that heat through the night. Archaeologists have documented Ondol construction dating back more than 2,000 years. In China, the Kang was a raised sleeping platform made of stone and brick, heated by a channel connected to the cooking fire, designed to keep families warm through northern Chinese winters with the heat generated by cooking alone. In ancient Rome, the Hipparcos system distributed heated air through channels beneath the stone floors of public buildings and private bathhouses, a sophisticated thermal mass heating approach that kept Romans warm in a time before any other heating technology existed in the Western world. On every inhabited continent, across an extraordinary span of human history, builders arrived at the same conclusion through observation and experience. Stone and masonry store heat. Metal wastes it. A hot exhaust is a sign of a failing system, not a functioning one. The Amish communities of Ohio and Pennsylvania descend from German and Swiss immigrants who arrived in North America in the 18th and 19th centuries. They brought the Kachelofen tradition with them because it was the heating system their families had used for generations, and because they knew it worked better than anything they had seen elsewhere. And then they simply never stopped using it. When the rest of America underwent the wholesale transition to forced air central heating in the decades following World War II, the Amish continued building masonry heaters in their homes, because the masonry heater was superior in every dimension that mattered to them. It used less fuel. It produced more even and comfortable heat. It required no external energy supply and no monthly payment to anyone. It was compatible with their commitment to self-sufficiency and economic independence. The transition away from masonry heating in mainstream American housing culture was not driven by the discovery of a better technology. It was driven by a marketing campaign. In the post-war period, manufacturers of forced air furnace systems and the fuel companies that supplied them undertook a deliberate and sustained effort to reposition masonry heating as backward, primitive, and associated with poverty and the immigrant past. Magazine advertisements and trade publications from the 1950s consistently framed central forced air heating as a marker of modern American success and comfort, something that distinguished the forward-looking American family from those still using the old ways. The message was effective partly because it carried truth in the context of scale and convenience. Forced air systems could heat larger homes with less construction complexity, and partly because it was repeated everywhere, while the counter-argument appeared nowhere. The people who stood to profit from the transition controlled the platforms through which Americans received information about home construction and maintenance. The people who knew the old way worked better were Amish farmers in rural Ohio who were not writing magazine articles or funding industry associations. Within a single generation, a heating tradition that had operated continuously for 1,000 years and had been brought to North America by millions of European immigrants was essentially erased from the mainstream American conception of what a heating system could be. The forced air furnace became the default. The masonry heater became a curiosity that most Americans had never heard of, and the utility companies and fuel suppliers that serviced those furnaces locked in a revenue stream from every American household that would continue without interruption for as long as those households existed. Now we arrive at the regulatory dimension of this story, which is where it moves from frustrating to genuinely enraging once you understand the specifics. The modern version of the thermal mass heating system, known as the rocket mass heater, is a design developed and refined through research at the Aprovecho Research Center in Oregon beginning in the 1970s. It applies the same core principles as the historic Kachelofen, using construction materials and techniques accessible to ordinary people without masonry training. The system has been built by thousands of people across the United States and documented extensively in the permaculture and sustainable building communities. Independent laboratory testing of properly built rocket mass heaters has consistently measured fine particulate emissions at approximately 12 grams per hour. The current EPA limit for a certified wood stove is 5 grams per hour. The rocket mass heater emits 20 times less particulate matter than the maximum the EPA permits from a commercially certified stove. It is cleaner than pellet stoves. It is cleaner than many gas appliances. Its environmental performance, when properly built and operated, is essentially unmatched among combustion-based heating systems. It is banned in 37 states, not because of what it emits, because of a piece of paper it does not have. The EPA certification process for wood-burning appliances is designed around factory manufactured products. It requires a manufacturer to submit identical units for laboratory testing, pay for factory inspections, maintain ongoing annual compliance fees, and repeat the entire testing process any time a design modification is made. The total cost of taking a new wood stove design through the EPA certification process exceeds $60,000, with the emissions test alone costing $25,000. A rocket mass heater is built on site by the people who will use it from locally available materials. Every installation is slightly different. There is no factory. There is no manufacturer. There is no entity capable of submitting a unit for testing because there is no unit to submit. The system cannot be certified, not because it fails the tests, but because the testing framework was built for a category of product that the rocket mass heater fundamentally is not. In 2022, a family in Jackson County, Oregon built a rocket mass heater in their home on 7 acres. They hired an independent testing laboratory to measure the emissions before the county inspector arrived. The results came back at 0, 12 grams per hour, 20 times below the EPA limit, the cleanest combustion heating measurement the testing lab had recorded from any residential system. The county ordered them to demolish it. The hearing officer's written ruling stated that compliance is determined by listing status, not by emission measurements. The actual performance of the system was legally irrelevant. The sticker was what mattered. They spent $4,200 tearing out the system they had built. They were then required to install a certified wood stove costing $9,800 that produces emissions 20 times higher than what they had. They paid $14,000 to replace a cleaner system with a dirtier one because the cleaner one lacked the correct paperwork. The certification process that produces that paperwork costs more than $60,000 and is only financially viable for manufacturing companies with the scale to absorb that cost across high-volume production runs. Manufacturing companies that sell stoves have no interest in certifying a competing system that costs $50 to build and eliminates the market for their products. The regulatory framework does not prevent unsafe systems from being built. It prevents systems that cannot be monetized at scale from being legally recognized, regardless of how well they actually perform. The 3 pathways that exist for homeowners who want to use this technology within the current regulatory environment are worth understanding in detail because they apply differently depending on your specific situation and location. The first is the outbuilding approach, building the thermal mass heater in an attached garage, workshop, or shed rather than in the main living space. Outbuildings are typically subject to less restrictive codes than primary residences in most jurisdictions. A thermal mass heater in a workshop that shares a wall with a kitchen, or that is connected to the main house by a short insulated run, carrying heated water or air, can effectively heat the primary living space while remaining in a regulatory category that is less likely to trigger the residential stove certification requirements. Homeowners across rural Tennessee, Oregon, Vermont, and other states have been using this approach successfully for years. The stove is in the workshop. The heat is in the house. Nobody's pretending otherwise. The second pathway is the traditional masonry heater exemption written into the Federal Register in 2014. The EPA rule that requires certification for wood-burning appliances includes a specific exemption for masonry heaters that weigh more than 1,800 pounds. A heater of that mass is classified as a masonry heater rather than a wood stove, and the certification requirements do not apply. A traditionally built Kachelofen-style heater constructed by a professional masonry heater builder meets this threshold without difficulty. Professional installation of a certified masonry heater costs between $3,000 and $8,000 depending on size and complexity. Against $42,000 in heating costs over 30 years, the payback period is typically less than 3 winter seasons, after which the heating cost for the remainder of the home's life approaches 0. The third reality is simply what is already happening quietly across the country. In rural areas with infrequent code enforcement, thousands of homeowners have built rocket mass heaters in their homes and outbuildings without seeking permits and without attracting regulatory attention. The emissions are low enough that there is no visible smoke plume and no detectable odor for neighbors. The systems have been operating for 5, 10, and 15 years in many documented cases without incident. The permaculture and sustainable building online communities contain extensive first-person documentation of this practice across dozens of states. These homeowners are not hiding in any meaningful sense. They simply decided that asking permission to heat their homes using a method their great-grandparents used without a second thought was not something they were willing to do. There is one final technical detail that separates the best implementations of this system from the merely good ones, and it is a detail almost nobody discusses in the quick overview content that most people encounter first. Most builders who construct a rocket mass heater route the internal gas channel through the thermal mass bench in a single straight or gently curved path. The hot gases enter one end, travel through the mass, and exit at the other end. This works. It captures substantially more heat than any metal stove. But the Aprovecho Research Center documented something in their long-term testing data that changes the performance calculation significantly. The internal channel geometry matters as much as the material. When the gas channel makes 2 complete reversals inside the mass, traveling back and forth through 3 full lengths of the bench before exiting, the exhaust temperature at the outlet drops from around 90 degrees to barely above ambient room temperature. Nearly 100% of the available heat is captured by the mass before the gases exit. The bench that stores heat for 12 hours, with a single straight channel, stores heat for 24 hours when the channel is routed through 2 reversals. The additional cost is 0. The additional materials are 0. You're using the same pipe routed differently. The additional labor is approximately 2 hours of modified construction during the initial build. This is the detail that separates a system that is dramatically better than a conventional stove from a system that is essentially perfect at the task of converting a small amount of fuel into a full day of even, comfortable warmth. The Amish farmer who built his stove for $50 in Holmes County already knew this. His grandfather taught him the internal channel geometry the same way his grandfather had been taught, and his grandfather's grandfather before that. Across 200 years of unbroken transmission from the German craftsmen who developed these principles under the pressure of a wood scarcity crisis 5 centuries ago. The Aprovecho researchers spent years and significant resources confirming experimentally what the family had preserved through practical tradition. The physics did not care which route it traveled to being known. It was always the same physics. That is the part that is most difficult to sit with comfortably. This knowledge never disappeared. It survived the Industrial Revolution and the post-war marketing campaigns and the regulatory frameworks and the half-century of cultural messaging that told Americans that paying monthly for warmth was simply the cost of modern life. It survived because communities like the Amish never accepted the premise that the old way was inferior just because someone with a financial interest in selling the new way said so. It survived in the research centers and the permaculture communities and the rural outbuildings of people who kept building and kept heating and kept paying nothing. Mark Twain encountered this stove traveling through Germany in 1878 and wrote about it with the frustrated clarity of someone watching an obvious truth being ignored. He called it the best and most economical stove ever invented. He wrote that 1 firing is enough for the entire day, the cost is essentially nothing, and the heat is even and constant rather than the violent cycling of too hot and too cold that he associated with American stoves. He ended by observing that Americans could adopt this system but would not, describing the American preference for inferior heating technology as an attachment to our own fearful inventions, of which there is not a rational one in the lot. That was 147 years ago. He was right then. The question is whether he will still be right in the next generation. A barrel, 20 fire bricks, clay from the yard, 1 weekend, $50. And the willingness to heat your home the way your great-grandfather would have considered obvious, simple common sense before someone decided that your comfort was worth more to them as a monthly revenue stream than as a problem you had already solved. The knowledge exists. It has always existed. The stove in Holmes County is warm right now and will be warm at midnight and warm at dawn tomorrow morning. It will be warm on nothing but 2 pieces of wood that burned out 6 hours ago. The fire is already out. The heat is already paid for. The bill is 0. It always could have been.